Good afternoon. My name is Peter Berkowitz from the Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy of the European Commission. I'm very pleased today to welcome our speakers and all of you for this new lecture series, and this is our inaugural academic lecture. The purpose of these lectures, which we, DG Regio, are jointly organising with the European Regional Science Association, is to discuss current research and evidence on key issues in regional and urban policy. These exchanges are very important for us. We're currently starting the work for the preparations on the post-2020 policy proposals for EU cohesion policy, and this will be a wide exercise, consultation with many actors, and input from the academic and research community is particularly important for us at this time. We plan 3 lectures this year, and this will be followed by another 6 next year on topics which we think are particularly relevant for cohesion policy. The topic of today's first lecture is the impact of cohesion policy on old and new member states. The lecture will be shared between 2 speakers and then followed by comments from a discussant, and then the questions will be opened up to the audience. We're very happy and lucky today to have 3 distinguished academics who I'm sure you all know already. Our first speaker is John Bachtler. John is Professor of European Policy Studies and Director of the European Policies Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. He has led many research projects in the area of regional policy and evaluation of EU funds, and he's regularly called on for his expertise by the Commission, the European Parliament and Member States. The second part of this lecture will be given by Grzegorz Gorzelak. He is Professor of Regional Economics and Director of the Centre for European Regional and Local Studies at the University of Warsaw. Grzegorz has published extensively on regional development and on the process of transformation in the Central and Eastern European countries. He has also frequently worked both for the European Commission and for the World Bank. Our discussant today is Daniela Constantin. Daniela is Professor of Economic Studies in Bucharest and the Director of the Research Centre for Macroeconomic and Regional Forecasting at Bucharest University. She's also the President of the Romanian section of the Regional Science Association, and she's carried out numerous research projects on regional policies, competitiveness, and other related topics. Finally, I'd like to thank our audience. We have an excellent audience today for coming to this lecture on a Friday afternoon. We have in this room representatives of the Council, the European Parliament, the Committee of the Regions, and from the representations of member states and regions, as well as many colleagues from DG Regio and other Commission DGs. I hope that we will have an interesting discussion at the end of this event. Before giving the floor to the speakers, I'd just like to mention that, as you can see, the lecture is being filmed and will be available later on the InfoRegio and ERSA websites to allow a broader audience to share in our enjoyment of the talks today. Questions and answers will be public and will be recorded. Therefore, I would like to ask you all to switch off your mobile phones now or put them into airplane mode so that the filming can continue undisturbed. So let's start off, and John, I think you are our first speaker today. You have 20 to 25 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure that's going to have to be re-edited, so I'll say it again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm impressed to see so many people on a Friday afternoon. At this time, we'd struggle to fill a lecture hall at the university with so many people. It's a pleasure to be here at the start of this very interesting initiative, this very interesting series of lectures. I'd like to start off by talking, as Peter said, about cohesion policy in the old member states. And the main title of the presentation is "What have structural and cohesion funds done for us?" Those of you who are fans of Monty Python and recall the the film Life of Brian, we may remember a scene when there is a discussion among a Jewish rebel group complaining about the Roman occupation, and they're saying, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then there's a bit of a discussion. They say, well, yeah, clean roads. Okay, yes, clean roads, of course. A safe environment? Yes, of course, safe environment. A good water supply? Yes, good water supply. Well, apart from good roads, a safe environment, clean water supply, and so on and so on, what have they done for us? Nothing. And I think there are perhaps similarities with the debate sometimes about cohesion policy, and that particularly during reform debates, there is sometimes a tendency to underplay what cohesion policy has done. And it was particularly to try and address this question of what structural funds have done for us that a project was commissioned by the DG Regio Evaluation Unit a few years ago to assess the long-term achievements of cohesion policy and to look at what cohesion policy has done, not just within one program period, but across the entirety of the period from 1989 to 2012, which is when we finished the study. And the presentation today is a synthesis of a synthesis. There is a huge amount of research in terms of case study material and comparative report material and data that is fed into this, and I'm hoping that the presentation today will encourage you to perhaps dip into some of the material and particularly explore further some of the issues that I'm raising today. I'll start off by saying a little bit about the study because it had a rather distinctive methodology, and then I'll address some of the key questions. And our starting point was really to say, well, what did structural funds do over that period? And that's not a straightforward question, given that we don't have a continuous data set, even on spending, in terms of what was spent, where and when. And we also didn't just look at the spending, we also wanted to look at what was done with the spending, so we looked at the strategies. And there are, of course, generations of strategies across the different periods. 89 to 92, extended to 93, then 94 to 99, split into two parts, of course, in Objective 2 regions, 2000 to 2006, 2007 to 13. And then the key question was what was achieved in terms of effectiveness, what was achieved firstly in terms of what the programs set out to do in terms of the objectives they set for themselves, and then in reality what was achieved. And then looking at this concept of utility, did this actually make a difference? Not just in terms of the objectives of the programs, but in terms of the lives of people within the regions, the development needs and challenges within the regions. And lastly, I'll pull together some conclusions and lessons that apply, first of all, to the current period in terms of the justification, the rationale for the reform that we've just gone through and are now implementing, but also I think it has some implications for the debate that's just starting on post-2020. Now, firstly, where did we do the research? Well, we identified 15 case study regions in the old member states in the EU15. There was, you can see that there were a series of Objective 1 or convergence regions, regions which were less developed, as we call them now, through the entire period of structural funds intervention. Then those that started off maybe in one category in Objective 1 or and then were phased out or went through some sort of transition process. And then we had 3 Objective 2 regional competitives or more developed regions, Aquitaine, North Rhine-Westphalia and Northeast England. So we have a broad geographical spread and a mix of different types of regions. I said that we had a distinctive methodology, an innovative approach to looking at the effectiveness of structural funds. Much of the work, which I'm sure you're aware of, that has been done on the effectiveness of structural funds has looked at the impact on growth, on employment, or various measures of competitiveness. We didn't look at those relationships, or we didn't look at those relationships specifically. We wanted to take a different slant, essentially an experimental theory-based evaluation, where we tried to reconstruct the intervention logic of the programs. And our question was, what was it that the policymakers who were designing the programs, what were they seeking to change? Partly explicitly, what they wrote in the programs in terms of development objectives, but also in reality, because we know that certainly looking back, there were often implicit development objectives, that what was said in the programs was partly presentational, and that there was perhaps sometimes a different approach, or that a different approach developed because when it came to allocating resources, there were maybe different pressures. So what we were interested in is asking ourselves, what did policymakers set out to do? Did they do it? To what extent was the logic that informed those programs appropriate for regional circumstances? And crucially, look, because we were looking over time, we were looking across program periods, what was the evolution in that intervention logic, and how did that change over the 1989 to 2012 period? And lastly, we sought to bring this together with an assessment of the achievements of the ERDF and Cohesion Fund programs in terms of their relevance, effectiveness, and utility. Just very briefly, we took a mixed methods approach, so and I won't go in detail. We had a variety of methods. Importantly, in terms of undertaking the analysis and trying to bring together all the data on expenditure, looking at strategies, analysing their effectiveness, we grouped structural funds intervention into 8 thematic axes, which are listed on screen there in terms of innovation, enterprise, structural adjustment or industrial modernization, infrastructure, environment, labour market, social cohesion, and territorial cohesion, particularly community development. You won't be surprised to know that this was a formidable task, particularly the further back you go into history, the worse the data gets, the more difficult it is to find people who were actually involved in the programs, who in some cases, whether they were still alive, but also whether they could still recollect what the intervention logic was. That was perhaps beneficial in some respects because people were more prepared to be maybe open about the past than they would be at the time. Okay, so let me go into what we found in terms of the research, and let me start off with the issue of strategies and how the formulation of strategies evolved over time. I know that some people here were involved as far back as 89 to 93, but many weren't. And it's worth reflecting how far we've actually come in terms of the quality of strategies, because if you go back to those early programs in 89 to 93, these were essentially mechanisms or tools for justifying the allocation of resources. So you had very generic strategies which were built on a very weak conceptual basis. You see a lack of specific objectives, certainly compared to the last period or the current period. You have great difficulty finding targets, certainly in terms of physical outcomes, and almost complete lack of what I might call a coordinated approach. What you can see then from program period to program period is progressive improvements over time in terms of strategic planning, the sophistication of interventions, particularly in terms of SME and innovation support. And I think what comes through quite clearly, if you look at what was driving those in what we now call managing authorities, the role of the European Union, particularly the European Commission, was quite significant, particularly in breaking open some well-entrenched assumptions and development approaches in some regions. And we see this particularly over the last 10 to 15 years in the 2000 to 2006 period, and even more so in 2007 to 13, and I'll say a little more about that shortly. However, throughout the period, despite those improvements, the quality of objective setting and monitoring remained very weak. And coordination, getting a more integrated approach, was something that persistently was poor. Poor in different ways. In convergence regions, the issue was more one of coordination between the national programs and the regional programs, and you had some quite important discontinuities or lack of joined up thinking. And within the regional competitive regions, the Objective 2 regions, the problem was one of more joining up the EU interventions with domestic policy, particularly because EU policy was often a relatively small part of economic development intervention. What was quite important, though, was that throughout the period, programs generally had, program developers had an implicit understanding of what needed to be done, what the regional challenges were, and what needed to be addressed. So in terms of the needs of regions, programs had a high degree of relevance throughout the period. Whether they were effective or not is, of course, another question. Sorry, I'm getting a frozen. Let me try with the mouse here. Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you. Just to briefly say something about expenditure, one of the important achievements we felt in the study was just being able to create an expenditure profile. And what you see here are the expenditure profiles for each of the 15 case study regions, broken down by each of the 8 areas of intervention that I referred to before, and you can just see, if not the detail from the back, the big variation in expenditure. There was something like 146 billion euros of expenditure that we calculated across these 15 case study regions over the 1989 to 2012 period. Some quite large chunks of funding, between 15 and 26 billion in Sachsen-Anhalt in eastern Germany, and then in Campania in Norte, in Andalusia, in the Mediterranean regions, and then about 5 billion euro in some of the smaller regions. Sorry, I think there might. Okay. Just to say something about trends broadly, in terms of the Objective 1 convergence regions, the big shift, and I'm told I can't move away from the microphone, but the big shift is in the bottom, the second from bottom color, this one here, which is the infrastructure component, which went down from 43% in the 89 to 93 period to around about 15% in 2007 to 2013, with a much more, which a significant shift to categories of social cohesion and labour market actions over time. And this is an important shift. It's moving from thinking about the physical to the social or the personal, to thinking about people, which was an important change, particularly in Objective 1, and far more diversified strategies across a wider range of categories of intervention. And then in Objective 2, or regional competitiveness in employment regions, what you see at the start of the period is this big solid black bar at the top, which is enterprise support. And a lot of the money in that early period, or in those early periods, was going into fairly generic forms of investment aid, partly in terms of, this was still a high point of national regional policies that were based very much on regional aid instruments. Since then, competition policy, control of state aids, has had a significant effect in reducing the degree of spending on regional aid. But also, we've seen a shift away, particularly towards innovation. The vertical stripes in the bar second from right is the innovation category, which accounts for something like 55% of spending in the 2007 to 13 period. So there's some important shifts both in the strategies and in the areas of intervention. Where I'd got to was basically saying something about the shifts that had taken place in terms of the quality of strategies and in terms of the areas of intervention. Let me say something now about what worked and the issue of effectiveness. We looked at how relevant the strategies were over time to development needs. And as I intimated a little while ago, what was interesting was that it seemed to us that the majority of programs, they had a very good idea of what needed to be done. Their assessment of the development needs and challenges in their respective regions was sound. There were, you could take issue with a number of aspects of the analysis, but nevertheless, overall, they had a good analysis. What was problematic was their assessment of what was possible with the amount of money that was available and the timescale over which interventions would be implemented. Essentially, in many cases, they were unrealistic, sometimes wildly unrealistic, in terms of the objectives that were set, and insofar as targets were formulated, the targets that were set. And if you go back particularly to the 94 to 99 period, you can see that in regions, in Objective 2 regions, with relatively small amounts of money, we're talking about changing GDP growth rates or having an influence on unemployment rates over something like a 6 or 7 year period. So their realism was problematic, and as target setting became more of a requirement in programs, what you can see is either very unrealistic targets in terms of setting specific figures for what was to be achieved in terms of jobs, or a very considerable degree of sort of playing it safe and underplaying what the programs could achieve in terms of the targets that were set. If we look at then what the outcomes were in terms of interventions, it's perhaps easier just to talk about it under the different thematic axes because it becomes a bit more real. And often programs which were essentially doing things in quite a segmented way. Firstly, with respect to infrastructure, because a lot of the spending went on infrastructure, both the big projects and local interventions like business parks and so on. In general, programs knew how to do this. This was safe terrain that they were experienced in terms of delivering infrastructure, and by and large, these types of interventions were well delivered, not necessarily within the right timescale, or certainly, or within the cost margins that were forecast, but they were generally delivered. The problem was, of course, as we know with some major projects, their assessments of demand and usage. That while there were problems on the capital investment side, the problems were often with the operating costs and the operating revenue side, where these were aspects that were frequently poorly calculated and resulted in severe problems down the line, sometimes with the closure of, for example, big tourist projects and so on. As far as structural adjustments was concerned, particularly industrial modernization, this was often difficult, particularly in the Mediterranean programs, where what was called structural adjustment was really a way of providing ongoing support to existing sectors or firms that were perceived to be important for the region. And in fact, a lot of the money that went in there was actually delaying restructuring rather than promoting structural adjustment. And it wasn't until the 2000-2006 period, 2007 to 13, that you saw some of that kind of money that was going into those kind of things starting to be diverted into areas like innovation. Tourism also had a good record in terms of effectiveness overall, with some significant short and longer term benefits, and importantly, it contributed to changes in perception of regions, particularly to the outside world, in terms of regions which were associated with industrial decline. They were able to use tourist interventions to create a new narrative of what the region was about, in some cases sort of catching up with the reality. More problematic were interventions for innovation or entrepreneurship, where the effectiveness was often short-term, unless it was part of a more systemic approach to innovation and entrepreneurship that was dealing with the whole cycle, if you like, of entrepreneurship and small firm evolution, or from basic research through to application and commercial viability. On environmental measures, these were generally well delivered where they were concerned with environmental remediation, which is another form of the sort of infrastructure investment that was going on. What was much more difficult was the support that began to be provided during the 2000s to the green economy and for low carbon, where the investment or the interventions were more concerned with the private sector and business. Lastly, community development was again had a mixed record. It was successful often where we were talking about urban regeneration. Again, the physical side of things, much more difficult, was investment in softer measures to try and deal with some of the interrelated problems of social exclusion. Bringing that all together, so it's just looking automatically at the screen, the kind of conclusions which we could draw was that objectives that relied on public sector intervention were more easily achieved. And by that I mean physical infrastructure, environmental improvements, innovation infrastructure. But objectives which relied on private sector investment or entrepreneurial activity, these had a much more mixed record, depending on, as I just said, whether there was a systemic approach to planning interventions that addressed the demand as well as the supply side, and whether there was a coordinated approach to implementing measures and projects. And that really goes to the heart of what was revealed by the study. Those things that the public sector, agencies and departments and other implementing bodies, things that they had the capacity to deliver, and where deliverability was wholly or largely under their control, these kind of things, they worked by and large well. Interventions that relied on other partners, particularly on the private sector, that required either an understanding, an in-depth understanding of how the private sector worked and how interventions could make a difference, or that relied on demand that could vary according to the business cycle, these kind of interventions were really problematic. In terms of the design of strategies and interventions, what we could see was that there are a whole series of, if you like, design or implementation problems that, to a certain extent, still haven't been resolved or are at the heart of the latest reform. These were problems such as inadequate consideration of the additionality of interventions and deadweight, particularly in terms of enterprise support, where there was often not a realistic assessment of how additional the support would be. There was often a lack of prioritization of different types of interventions, a failure to concentrate support. And that's linked to an inadequate consideration of the appropriate scale of investment, the need, in some cases, to achieve critical mass in order to make a difference. And particularly in the 1990s, particularly in the 1994 to 99 period, or the 2000 to 2006 period, when the partnership principle arguably was at its height in many regions, one of the consequences of that was that you had pressure for a fragmentation or dispersal of interventions across a wide range of measures to address the different partner concerns. There were over-optimistic assumptions, as I said before, of the time period for interventions to be effective and yield results, and we saw that in particular in terms of university investment. We know that, or we could see that the kind of investment that's made in universities often takes 2 or 3 program periods to make a difference, and that also applies to other types of infrastructure support. There was an imbalance between the emphasis on public and private sector investments at different stages, and there was often insufficient attention to the spatial or territorial cohesion of regions, which led to a widening of disparities. There was, perhaps surprisingly, within regions, insufficient attention to the region as a coherent whole in terms of, and the way in which different interventions would have an effect on different parts of the region. I said one of the issues that we were looking at was utility, by which we meant, did they actually make a difference to the lives of people on the ground? Whatever they did in terms of meeting the objectives that were negotiated for the programs, what difference did they make on the ground, looking at the period as a whole? And here, what we can see is like an inverted pyramid of effects. What we saw in Ireland, which was one of the case studies, was that the programs contributed to a real transformative effect across the board. We could see a contribution to whole-scale change in terms of economic development, helping the country to take advantage of wider macroeconomic opportunities and strategies. In a few other regions, the contribution was significant at a regional level. And we saw this in the Algarve, in Andalusia, and in Galicia, where programs did contribute significantly to regional transformations. In most regions, though, the transformation was much more limited. There was a transformation in specific sectors or specific fields. And we can see that, for example, in Northeast England, where the effect was most pronounced in terms of urban regeneration and changes in perception of the region through investments in culture, in tourism. And lastly, there were a few regions like Burgenland, Itä-Suomi in Finland, and Nord-Pas-de-Calais in France, where the most one could say from the evidence was that programs had had a positive influence in terms of economic development, and partly that was because of the scale of funding, but also in terms of the way the funding was used. So overall, what did the structural funds do for us? It's clear that spending 146 billion euros made a significant contribution to regional development. We can see that across the board, particularly in certain regions, the quality of life improved significantly over the period, particularly where there was a massive investment in basic infrastructure and services, things like water supply, connectivity, environmental change, and so on. So the quality of life in regions, in many of the regions, was significantly better. I think also important, and something we shouldn't underestimate, and perhaps has been under-analysed, was the change in culture and mentality that was promoted by this investment. Partly that was a change in culture and mentality among those responsible for regional development, who were working within a framework, the structural funds framework, that was pushing the boundaries of thinking about strategic analysis, about program development, about management of programs, about monitoring and evaluation and accountability. It was also promoting a change in culture and mentality within the regions, where people could see that change was going, that change was going on, and people started to experience this change in narrative from regions that had a legacy of industrial decline or underdevelopment to more future-oriented. But there were, of course, buts. The process was, in virtually all regions, an incomplete one. It was a process that was territorially uneven. There's been significant difficulty in maintaining the benefits, particularly as funding has diminished. And perhaps most heartbreakingly, that the economic crisis has undone a significant proportion of the gains in a number of regions. We started off the study by sort of posing ourselves the question of whether the criticisms that were made of structural funds, of it being an old policy, of having poor performance, of lack of visible performance, the degree to which those criticisms were warranted. And to a certain extent, the answer is yes, they were warranted. They were warranted in the sense that the strategic justification and the accountability for spending was inadequate, particularly in the 1990s, although it has improved since then. However, we need to recognize that the kind of decisions that were being made about the objectives and targets of spending, they were situated very much in the orthodoxies of the time. If we go back to the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the decisions to spend a lot of money on infrastructure and generic forms of business aid, these were very much the kind of areas that theories and concepts of regional development were advocating, that you need better infrastructure to improve economic development in terms of connectivity and so on. Since then, of course, we have the mantra that infrastructure is an important but not the only area that needs to be supported. And while progress has been slow across, I think, virtually every region, we can see that there were improvements across time and across space. As I said a couple of times, programs were relevant to regional needs, and increasingly they were delivering on objectives, and they were making a more significant contribution to economic development. I think if we frame the study in the context of the reform that's just taken place, the study certainly provided justification, it provided evidence to support the directions of the reform of cohesion policy, particularly with respect to the concentration of resources, the importance of having coherent strategies, of integrated investment, sound project planning, the need for a development model and intervention logic to reform objective setting, and the critical requirement for investment in administrative capacity. I think the study, though, also highlighted a number of challenges and limitations in what the policy can achieve. And these are areas which I think go beyond the reform and are important for both the current period and about thinking on post-2020. And the first of these challenges is that we can see quite varied levels of commitment across member states, by which I mean managing authorities, implementing bodies, to what cohesion policy is about, in terms of ambition, in terms of vision, in terms of competence, and in terms of expertise. That you see big variations in the ability, and to a certain extent, the willingness of member states and regions to buy into what cohesion policy is trying to achieve, to see it as being more than a source of money that can be distributed to selected beneficiaries. That was true very much in 1890-93, and it's changed in many regions, but we can still see big variation. I think a second important issue is the relationship between the agenda of cohesion policy and domestic political and policy priorities. And there continues to be an issue, it seems to me, in terms of alignment between EU and domestic political priorities. Some of that has been, I think, addressed by the way in which the Commission position papers have been used to develop agendas together with member states. It's been influenced by the Common Strategic Framework and national strategic frameworks through the partnership agreements. I think also, while the study provides support for the use of conditionalities, what it also shows is the limitations, or I think an implication of the study, is the limitations of conditionalities as a mechanism of control. Everything that we've learnt about conditionalities, particularly from the development policy literature, tells us that conditionalities can be incredibly important tools, but only where they are owned by those agents who are the targets of those conditionalities. If not, then conditionalities can cause serious problems. And finally, I think the study reinforces the long-term timescales over which one can bring about change. I mentioned that in the context of certain types of infrastructure spending, but it also applies more broadly to the type of ambitions that our case study regions had, and the degree to which it takes successive periods and phases of intervention, partly because it's about learning what works, partly because of the interrelated nature of the challenges, that there is a sequential nature to, you have to do something about certain basic conditions before you can get on to dealing with other more complex issues. It's partly because the institutions that are required for effective economic development take time to develop. And I think that has implications for long term, because it brings into question the approach that we have about thinking in 6 or 7 year time horizons as units of implementation. So I think we have food for thought in terms of looking forward about how we can secure the commitment of member states to the kind of economic development ambitions that we have at European level, how we can assure that there is an alignment of the European and the domestic political and policy agendas, how it is that conditionalities can be owned as well as imposed, and how we can develop a longer-term approach to implementing economic and social change. Thank you very much.